Welcome to this explainer. If you've ever watched the Winter Olympics, you've probably looked at those athletes hurtling down an icy chute and thought, wow, they're just sliding down a hill on a sled. But what looks like a simple gravity ride is actually an invisible, incredibly high-stakes war. We're talking extreme physics, microscopic biomechanics, and some truly radical neurology. Okay, let's dive right into this. Just looking at the immediate visual contrast between these two sports, you can see how wild it is. In luge, the athlete is in what's called the decubitus dorsal position, basically lying on their back, going feet first. But skeleton, that takes the procubitus approach, lying flat on their stomach, plunging down absolutely head first. Right away, you realize these aren't just different types of sleds. They are fundamentally, totally different ways of exposing the human body to the elements. So to truly understand the madness here, we're going to take a journey from the macro all the way down to the micro. First up, the two radical approaches. Second, the biomechanics of extreme forces. Third, we'll look at the neurological architecture. And finally, the toll on the body. All right, part one, two radical approaches, luge versus skeleton. Let's lay out the foundational differences between the equipment and the raw speed these athletes are dealing with. Just take a look at these numbers. Data from the biomechanics experts at Kinexa reveals something pretty surprising. Luge is actually the faster of the two. They hit blistering speeds of 140 to 150 kilometers per hour, all on a fairly light sled weighing just 23 to 27 kilograms. Skeleton is slightly slower, 130 to 145 kilometers per hour, and uses a much heavier sled, up to 43 kilograms. But here is the fascinating twist. Skeleton creates a terrifying illusion of speed. Because the athlete is head first, their eyes are literally just 5 centimeters away from the blurring ice. This creates this mind-bending go-kart effect, where it feels infinitely faster and way more chaotic than it actually is. Which brings us right into Section 2, the biomechanics of extreme forces, and specifically managing 5G. Let's look at what those insane speeds actually do to a human body. 5Gs. Just let that number sink in for a second. When these athletes enter the banked turns of an ice track, they aren't just gently steering. They are literally being crushed by gravitational forces up to 5Gs. That means 5 times their own body weight is violently pressing their skeletal structure against the hard carbon fiber of that sled. To survive this without just completely collapsing, their biomechanical alignment has to be absolutely flawless. Now, what's really interesting about this is what happens to the neck. Under this kind of G-force, the neck becomes a major battleground. Think about it. An athlete wears a helmet weighing maybe 1.5 kilograms, but under 5 Gs of centrifugal force, that helmet and head suddenly turn into a virtual 40-kilogram weight. In luge, the deep neck flexors have to fire on all cylinders just to keep the head slightly raised, and in skeleton, the neck extensors are completely tetanized, locked in maximum tension, just to keep their chin from smashing into the ice. If those muscles fail for even a fraction of a second, their face hits the ice at 130 kilometers per hour. No way around it. And all that extreme pressure cascades right down into the abdominal core, creating what experts call the isometric paradox. See, to pilot these sleds, the athlete's core has to be perfectly rigid. That absolute stiffness is non-negotiable so they can transmit kinetic energy from their body straight into the sled. But simultaneously, and here's the paradox, their body must remain supple enough to absorb the violent chattering vibrations of the ice. It's just this constant, exhausting tightrope walk of controlled rigidity. And getting that controlled rigidity right is absolutely essential for steering. Biomechanical modeling from Kinexa actually debunks a huge myth here. The idea that lugers steer just by pushing their calves against the runners of the sled. Actually, scratch that. It's more like a stunning kinetic chain of force transfer. It starts deep in the core with the psoas muscle initiating a tiny, barely there 2 to 3 degree rotation of the pelvis. This kicks off a kinetic wave that travels down through the adductors, in the knee, and finally hits the calves at the ankle to apply pressure to the skate. Every single joint has to align with millimeter precision. So what does this all mean? It really comes down to the razor-thin margin of error we're dealing with. If an athlete increases pressure on their skate by just 10% for a mere 0.1 seconds, it alters their trajectory coming out of a turn by a massive 3 to 5 centimeters. In a sport where you were separated from the wall by literal millimeters, a tenth of a second of muscle miscalculation is the difference between an Olympic gold medal and a devastating crash. All right, to maintain that kind of superhuman physical precision, the brain has to process information at speeds that are hard to comprehend. That's Section 3, the neurological architecture under pressure. We're zooming in from the muscles, deep into the gray matter. The best way to understand how a Luger's brain actually works is through a mathematical concept called the Kalman filter. It's a model that describes how the brain weighs actual sensory input against its own internal predictions. Now, the sensory input on a luge track is incredibly noisy. You've got intense vibrations, roaring wind, brutal G-forces. A beginner is going to trust those chaotic senses. But an expert luger, they operate with a Kalman gain of around 0.2. This means their brain is actually ignoring about 80% of what it's feeling and seeing. Instead, they rely almost entirely on an internal, perfectly memorized 3D map stored in their hippocampus. They are true spatial navigators, driving the track from memory rather than reacting to what's happening. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast with the sheer wildness of skeleton. While lugers rely on that internal calm, a skeleton athlete's brain is absolutely exploding with sensory data. Their vestibular nerve, that's the part of the brain handling balance and spatial orientation, shows a massive 380% increase in activation. To put that into perspective, that level of stimulation actually exceeds what fighter pilots experience in simulated aerial combat. Skeleton athletes aren't just navigators, they are emotional warriors surviving a terrifying sensory assault. And we can actually see this difference in their EEG brainwaves. Lugers operate dominantly in theta and alpha brainwaves, which points to a state of active relaxation and spatial navigation. They are incredibly calm in the chaos. But skeleton athletes? Their brains are flooded with high beta and gamma waves. This signifies intense cognitive stress and extreme sensory integration. Even though they're sliding down the exact same ice track, their brains are living in completely different universes. So what exactly happens when you subject the human body and brain to 5Gs, isometric paradoxes, and a 380% sensory overload? Let's get into Section 4, the toll on the body, cumulative microtraumas. For this, we're turning to the medical insights of sports physician Dr. Christophe Delong. A typical race only lasts about 60 seconds, but man, in that single minute, the body sustains some serious hidden damage. According to Dr. Delong's research, the extreme compression and shear forces cause literal microtears in the cervical discs of the spine. That takes 48 to 72 hours to heal. The intense isometric holds, they cause microtears in the muscle fibers. Incredibly, that 380% sensory overload we were just talking about, it causes a temporary desensitization of the vestibular system that takes hours to reset. Their very sense of balance is momentarily blown out. To survive a grueling, months-long season of this, elite sliding teams rely on cutting-edge recovery protocols, heavily informed by experts like Dr. Delong. We're talking sci-fi level stuff here. They use RTMS, repetitive magnetic brain stimulation, to accelerate neurological recovery. They blast tendons with acoustic shock waves to stimulate new blood vessels. They use photobiomodulation, basically bathing cells in specific red and infrared light to bring down inflammation. And they constantly track deep sleep through polysomnography because, at the end of the day, sleep is the ultimate predictor of how they'll perform the next morning. Which leaves us with this incredibly provocative question to think about. How does the brain of a slider evolve after 15 to 20 years of extreme neuroplasticity? When you spend decades either overriding your own sensory inputs or pushing your vestibular system past the limits of a fighter pilot, how does that fundamentally rewire what it means to be human? It's a fascinating mystery right at the absolute cutting edge of sports science. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.